let me say that these 2 days were very exciting, and our young participants, they pointed out 3 points. Young people in the decision-making process in the future about weather, climate change, and inequalities. Act to reduce global inequalities. Act to keep the temperature rise below 1.5, so act seriously towards the climate change. There will be no ecological transition if we don't care about the global equality in the planet. That's very important. So this will be presented in detail later by the representatives. And before starting and giving the floor to the distinguished guest, I want to thank and welcome President of the Republic, His Excellency Sergio Mattarella, today, who's here honoring for his presence. And I want to thank the Prime Minister, Mario Draghi. Thank you for being here, Mario. And the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who will be connected soon, joining from London. And we will also have a short video message recorded by the United Nations Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres. And finally, least but not last, I want to thank all the ministers and authorities here from all over the world joining us for this meeting, for the conclusion of the meeting. Thank you very much for being here and for the long travel you had. Your presence is really very important. Thank you. So at this point, I think I finished my time. I hope I acknowledged everybody, and of course the local authorities for hosting us in Lombardy and in Milan. Thank you to the mayor and to the president of the governor of the Regione. I give the floor to the Prime Minister, Professor Mario Draghi, for his welcome address. Mario, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Signor Presidente della Repubblica, Prime Minister Johnson, President Fontana, Mayor Sala, all the delegates, Prime Minister Johnson, President Fontana, Mayor Sala, let me say, very welcome to all the delegates from all over the world, excellencies and young delegates. I would like to thank all the young people who've worked so hard over the past few months, and especially over the past 3 days. You represent the largest generation of youth in history. Around 3 billion people below the age 25, and very importantly, the large majority of which is from low and middle income countries. This generation, your generation, has the most to lose from climate change. And you know extremely well the dramatic consequences of global inequalities on poverty, malnutrition, access to health. You're right to demand accountability and change. Under current trends, we are falling short of our promise to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And the pandemic and climate change have contributed to push nearly 100 million people into extreme poverty, bringing the total to 730 million people who are in extreme poverty. The climate, health, and food crises are deeply intertwined. We must act faster, much faster, and more effectively to tackle all of them. The ecological transition is not a choice, it's a necessity. We only have 2 options ahead of us. Either we face the costs of the transition now, or we act later and pay the much higher price of a climate disaster. The recovery from the pandemic is an opportunity to push our climate ambitions forward and do it fairly. And the state must be ready to help families and companies beat the short-term costs of the transition. Italy is pulling out all the stops to ensure countries move in the right direction and do it fast. In Europe, we contributed to set up the Next Generation EU program to ensure an equitable and sustainable recovery. It sets the green transition as one of its three pillars, together with digitalization and social inclusion. Italy has earmarked 40% of the fund in our recovery plan to the ecological transition. We aim to increase the share of renewable sources in our energy mix, make mobility more sustainable, improve the energy efficiency of our buildings, and safeguard biodiversity. As G20 presidency and co-chair of COP26 with the United Kingdom, we are pushing countries to honor their climate pledges and in some cases stand ready to make bolder ones. If we want to be successful, all countries have to do their part, starting from the G20 ones. The G20 includes countries that make up more than 80% of the world GDP and over 75% of the global emissions. All major players and emitters are there. In June, G20 ministers of education committed to promoting education for sustainable development in school curricula. In July, the Energy and Climate Ministries in Napoli committed to allocating large shares of their recovery plans to a green transition. But we are aware that we have to do more, a lot more. This is the aim of the Rome summit that will take place at the end of October. We want to achieve a G20 commitment about the need to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. And we must develop long-term strategies that are consistent with 1.5 degrees. At the same time, we need to fulfill the $100 billion pledge to support developing countries. Low and middle-income economies are often more vulnerable to the effect of climate change. And emissions in each area of the world inevitably affects the rest of the globe. So it is both a moral imperative to support their transition and a pressing need. We grown-ups have learned what we have to do: mitigate, adapt, and raise funds to help poorer countries to do the same. But more than anything else, we now have to do it. We now have to act. I firmly believe that we have a lot to learn from your ideas, suggestions, and leadership. And your pressure, frankly. Your pressure is very welcome. We need to be whipped into action. Your mobilization has been powerful, and rest assured, we are listening. Thank you.
Thank you to Prime Minister Mario Draghi for this inspiring speech. And I would like to give the stage now to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, This is in the video from London. Boris, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished guests, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Great speech, Mario, and ciao from Londra. I'm very sorry I'm not able to be with you today, but I just want to say to all of you at this gathering that Mario, you and I, we've got to face it. We were born in the 1960s. The politicians, I'm afraid, like us, we're middle-aged people, and we're going to be meeting to thrash out the world's path to net zero in just a few weeks' time at COP26. But it will be the people in the audience. It will be your generation, young people, who are left to deal with the consequences if we should fail. Because a child born in 2020 will endure 7 times as many extreme heat waves and twice as many droughts as their grandparents. And as this gathering has heard in sometimes harrowing detail, young people around the world are already paying the price for the reckless actions of their elders. Hundreds of millions of you are facing rising seas, failing crops, burning forests, and ever more ferocious storms. Daily challenges that lead to lost opportunity. And your future is literally being stolen before your eyes. And I saw the protesters earlier on, and frankly, you have every right to be angry with those who aren't doing enough to stop it. And perhaps the most frustrating thing is that we know we can stop it. There is still just enough time to put on the brakes. We know what needs to be done. We just have to get on with it. It's a big task and one that will ask a lot of absolutely everybody. But change on the scale we need is perfectly possible. When I was a child, something like 80% of the UK's electricity was generated by burning coal. Even as recently as 2010, we got 10 times more electricity from fossil fuels than from renewables. Yet today, as I speak to you, most of the electricity consumed in the UK comes from clean, green sources. Our carbon emissions are barely half what they were in 1990. And coal, which was once the undisputed king of the energy mix, now accounts for less than 2% of our electricity, a number that will go to 0 in the next couple of years. And I tell you this not because I want to brag about how great the UK is, because I'm the first to admit that we all have much more to do, but because I want to show what can be achieved when people and politicians have the will to make change happen. That's why it's so important that these 3 days are not the end of the story. We've got 190 countries represented here, almost 190 countries represented here. And if between now and November, the COP26 summit, that you all continue to raise your voices in the way that you have, as passionately and articulately as you are doing, and if you can keep talking to the politicians and the business leaders where you live about this issue and why you care about it and why we must have action, then what I'm saying to you is we can turn this thing around. And there are 4 things that we want to come out of COP26, 4 big changes in our approach. And it's very easy to remember. It's coal, cars, cash, and trees. Coal, cars, cash, and trees. We want to move away, as I've described, we want to move away from using coal as the way we generate electricity. We want to move towards renewable. We want all the countries in the world to move off coal. We want everybody to stop using internal combustion engine vehicles, and it can be done. People are moving away from them as we speak. As Mario has just said in his really excellent speech, we want to raise the funds that the whole world needs, the developing world in particular, to tackle climate change. And we need to get up to $100 billion, and we need to plant hundreds of millions, if not trillions, of trees around the world. And if we do all that, we can make COP26 in November, which Mario and I are working on. We can make it the beginning of the end of climate change. And so, without being unduly rhapsodical, when you're my age, you young folks, you young thrusters out there, you'll inhabit not a world on fire, but a planet where your phones and your computers and your lights are powered by the wind and the water, the waves, and by the sun. You'll inhabit a world where electric cars glide silently down your streets from California to Cape Town, emission-free, guilt-free, jet zero planes will fly overhead, and all of us will be able to deal with whatever the climate throws at us. So what I'm saying to you is that the situation is dire and it's frightening, but change is possible and it can be done. So help me and help us to make it happen at COP26. And together, let's make this Earth the planet that you deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister Johnson, for this inspiring comment to the work. And now I would like to remind that we are working, the Italian and the UK government, for the COP26, and I want to thank you, President Alok Sharma, being here today, for his presence. Alok, it's a pleasure to have you here because you're taking, you witness what has been done here, and we forward the messages of the young people to the COP26 event. Thank you, Alok. So we have now a last message from His Excellency Antonio Guterres that should be digital, and I leave the floor to the message.
The climate crisis is a code red for humanity. It is already devastating lives and livelihoods. As usual, the poorest and most vulnerable are the hardest hit. The window of opportunity to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis is closing quickly. We know what needs to be done, and we have the tools to do it. Young people have been in the forefront of putting forward positive solutions, advocating for climate justice and holding leaders to account. We need young people everywhere to keep raising your voices for a breakthrough in building resilience and ensuring that at least 50% of climate support is for adaptation to protect lives and livelihoods. For developed countries to finally deliver on their promise of $100 billion a year in climate finance to the developing world. For more governments, businesses and investors to reduce their emissions in line with the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. This means that they must commit to net zero by mid-century with ambitious 2030 targets and clear plans to achieve them. For ramping up climate education, green jobs and fair and inclusive economic growth, leaving no one behind. I thank the government of Italy for providing this global stage for young people to engage directly with policymakers. And I thank the more than 400 young people for contributing your ideas and solutions in advance of COP26. Your solidarity and demands for action set a powerful example. We need national leaders to follow your example and ensure the ambition and results we need at COP26 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you for this powerful message. And now we go to the core of the morning. So we will have the presentation by the rapporteurs of the 4 tables that have been working the last 2 days for the key messages to be forwarded to the COP26. And I'm extremely pleased to call on the stage the first rapporteur. This is Ernst from the Fiji island, and will Ernst is reporting about the key messages of the table named Sustainable Recovery. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Hopefully the volume is okay. Thank you very much for having us here today. At the outset, I would like to thank all delegates not just today, but continuously, that work to understand and change this system, a system that continually fails us, but challenge it in a way that is constructive. By engaging in these processes, influencing a narrative of change, and calling out bad behavior, work like these past few days is a sign of a changing wind. And we young people are this wind. I had the absolute pleasure of working with, I said at the beginning, the best looking and certainly the most vivacious group, the Sustainable Recovery Track. We have 5 key messages, and the first one is to do with energy transition and green jobs. When we think about this, it must be 2 things. It must be just and it must be sustainable. We cannot, on the one hand, transition away from fossil fuels and in the same breath turn our backs on workers and people who've been forced into this industry. We therefore call for an urgent, holistic, diversified, and inclusive energy transition by the year 2030. This must prioritize energy efficiency and sustainable energy, keeping in line with the 1.5 goal. This means financing for capacity building and research and technology sharing to ensure a transition with decent jobs, providing adequate support for affected and vulnerable communities. In terms of adaptation and resilience, the language is stronger here, so I urge you to listen carefully. We demand the strengthening of diverse means of implementation to be made immediately available for locally owned adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage measures to ensure proper and continuous solutions again reach the most vulnerable groups and regions. And to be clear, immediately is not synonymous with by 2030 or by 2050. It means now. In terms of nature-based solutions, we demand nature-based solutions be prioritized as a key strategy to address the climate crisis that also emphasizes the need for a socially just and equitable society, especially by recognizing, representing, respecting, and protecting local and indigenous peoples' rights and place-based knowledge. Nature-based solutions is key. It's not a box-ticking photographable strategy. It's vital. Indigenous peoples have been the only people to successfully foster a relationship between our existence and the environment, and we must therefore take their lead. And now the all-important point of financial flows. Yesterday, a delegate said a great quote: "Conservation without finance or resourcing is a conversation." And we need more than just talk. As a result, we urge decision makers at all levels in public and private sectors to create a transparent and accountable climate finance system, because we know the current one is not working, with robust regulation of carbon emissions, eradicating the climate investment trap in the most vulnerable communities, whilst ensuring equal opportunities for people of all genders, ages, and backgrounds, and really importantly, as well as eradicating the exploitation of women and child labor. In essence, put your money where your mouth is and make financing accessible. Have faith in us the same way that you were so quick to have faith in trickle-down economics, because look where that got us. And finally, and this is particularly important for regions like my own in terms of tourism, we demand that at COP26, the recognition of tourism's responsibility in meeting global climate targets, but also its vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change, particularly for tourism-dependent countries. We call for the inclusion of all stakeholders, youth, women, indigenous communities, and other marginalized groups in capacity building, monitoring, investment and decision-making processes towards resilient blue and green tourism recovery. Just to clarify once more, when I say this is to take place at COP26, What we mean is that by the end of the COP process, when our leaders are laying back in the leather seats of business class, they are celebrating this feat. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much, Ernst, for this, for breaking the ice with this first presentation. We have now the second table, Youth for Driving Ambition, introduced by Nisreen from Sudan. And while Nis comes, let me remind to all delegates and all our guests that were about 400 people here that were selected out of 8,700 applications from 189 countries. So,
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. صباح الخير عليكم جميعا. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and also buongiorno a tutti. Well, Youth Driving Ambition was the general theme for this event. It was also the theme for one of the most amazing working groups. In a very long 2 days, young people worked very hard in order to send the messages not only for themselves, but for the rest of the young people around the world on how we need climate action to be tackled urgently. One of the biggest features of this session was the sense of urgency and the sense of alarming that we are still going in the wrong direction. More than 6 scientific reports were out by UNEP, UNFCCC, and IPCC. All of them are saying that we are going completely in the wrong direction and unfortunately speeding into the wrong direction. Young people around the world are not only worried about the future of humanity, we are also worried about the future of other creatures that we share the same planet with. It's not only about humans, it's also about the biodiversity that we are losing every day. I am afraid that not only you, the old generations, but only us will be the last generations to witness the planet as it is. I watched a movie once, and in the movie, the lady said, well, the old generation were the last generation to see the sky with only stars, because now there is stars and satellites, and we cannot distinguish between stars and satellites. So I'm really afraid that we are going to be the only generation or the last generations to see small island states like Maldives, for example, like Fiji, my friend and colleague Ernest from, like other hundreds of small island states that only 2 meters away from the sea level. For that reason, young people in the Youth Driving Ambition theme worked into 3 levels. Level number 1 was the multilateral, because young people showed that only with cooperation between countries and with the shared by different responsibilities, and with acknowledging the historical responsibility of the developed countries and the big emitters, only together we can go forward to the right direction, and only now we can take actions to prevent the catastrophe. We worked also on the national level because we acknowledge the different specifications for different countries. A lot of countries are talking about electric cars. Well, I come from a country where only 30% have access to electricity in the first place. So how can I speak about electric cars? We speak about striking from schools to pressure the world leaders. I come from a country where more than 5 million kids at the age of school are out of schools. A lot of us are coming from a country where actually we depend on the rain to feed our agriculture and to feed our people. So if we have too much rain, then it's a flood, which is a disaster. If we have too little rain, then it's a drought, it's also a disaster. So it's really important to take the concept of the local communities. Last but not least, we had the local level, which is the young people in the grassroots communities, the marginalized group, the indigenous people, and our territories, our deep inside small tribes that have indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices that they can conserve their nature in their own way. Our key messages are meaningful participation, and we mean by that we request countries and relevant institutions to urgently ensure meaningful youth engagement and involvement in all decision-making on processes with implications on climate change and climate policy, planning, designing, implementation, and evaluation at multilateral, national, and the local level with an enabling environment. We said enabling environment because we know that a lot of environmental activism are targeted as we speak. A lot of them were killed, jailed, and kicked out of their countries only because they are trying to protect the environment that we are all living in. The second key out message was capacity building. We request all countries to urgently scale up financial, administrative, and logistical support to foster the engagement of youth to effectively drive climate ambition and concerned action. Third and last, funding. Request countries, international organizations, and public and private financial institutions to urgently dedicate and make ready accessible funds to support youth participation in decision-making processes with implications to climate change at all levels. These are our key takeouts in the three items or subtopics we spoke on. So all of these key messages works on the three levels of multilateral, national, and local. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nisreen. Well, sharp and clear. We go to the third table, non-state actors engagement, and the rapporteur is Nathan Meteny from France.
I am quite taller than Greta, right? Ciao a tutti, bonjour, mi chiamo Nathan. Two things from the non-state actors working group. First, very quickly, we realized that the most important thing we were here today, yesterday, and the day before was for us, for our movement, to be together, to meet each other after years of working in these times of pandemic. And so therefore, we tried to create this space in our working group to make sure that everyone could meet, could chat, and to create great friendship. Second very important thing is that we realized very quickly that we are not asking for just climate action. We are asking for climate action rooted in social justice. Four key takeaways from us. First, we concretely ask you to support participation of young entrepreneurs, artists, farmers, athletes, in particular from emerging countries and marginalized groups. And by that, we mean ethnic minorities, indigenous people, LGBTQI+ people, BIPOC communities, people with disabilities, and so on and so on. As well as already existing non-state actors with ethical and sustainable practices in the adoption of climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions by facilitating access to public and private finance, as well as development of critical infrastructure, such as access to internet. We demand non-state actors, in particular the private sectors, to align current and future operations and their supply chain with net zero emissions now. The transition needs to start immediately and requires clear reporting of plans and achievement of milestones at least on an annual basis. We need to enhance, and we ask you to do that, to enhance environmental transparency and accountability of non-state actors by requesting robust and annual climate disclosures that include underlying source data, ensure that this disclosure and data sets are consolidated by a relevant entity. But most importantly, and that has been something extremely important in our group, we need to abolish fossil fuels industry rapidly and immediately with a total phase out by 2030 at the latest, and secure a decentralized, just transition designed with and for workers, cooperatives, local and indigenous communities, and those most affected by the climate crisis. Any non-state actors, and we say any non-state actors, including UN bodies, fashion, sport, art, entrepreneurship, agricultural entities, must not accept any fossil fuels investments, lobbying activities, or influence from this industry, especially in the international negotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan. And we go to the last table, that is Climate Conscious Society, and the rapporteur is Sophia from the United States.
This is a bit too tall for me? Okay. Hello, everyone, and particularly hello to my fellow youth delegates who have worked so hard over these past 3 days, hopefully not in vain. And of course, hello, Prime Ministers and Ministers of Environment and Climate. I'm Sophia Chiani, and I had the distinct pleasure of serving as the co-chair of the Climate Conscious Society theme. I've seen firsthand that through bold, diverse youth leadership, young activists have served as an integral component of the youth movement and the climate movement, ensuring a future with sustainable citizens and environmental leaders. Our incredible delegates have finalized a comprehensive document with 4 key points of showcasing impacts and solutions, education, public awareness and mobilization, and lastly, media. It is crucial to educate and engage all sectors of our population in order to see meaningful climate action. We are hopeful that the Ministers of Education and Environment who will be attending COP26 will pledge to support climate change education and youth empowerment in ways outlined in our document. Some of the most important messages that our group would like to stress are as follows. Beginning with showcasing impacts and solutions, countries and decision makers should be held accountable to ensure that their words are translated into action. As Greta said just a few days ago, we don't want any more blah, blah, blah. We want to see concrete changes and actions taken. Decision makers should enlist support from young people like us and climate advisors to highlight the impacts of decisions made on social, humanitarian, rights, equality, and justice aspects. They need to support vulnerable communities, including indigenous and disadvantaged people, especially those in low socioeconomic areas. They need to amplify diverse voices, such as those of young, indigenous, and marginalized people. And lastly, it will be critical to see a multi-stakeholder platform set up for regular information and knowledge sharing, including for showcasing solutions, sharing gender and equal participation practices. Following up with education, we call on global leaders to call on their governments and other relevant actors to raise awareness on climate change, adaptation, and mitigation by funding and ensuring universal climate change education for all. We must provide education that addresses systematic issues, as well as promoting changes in lifestyles, attitudes, and behaviors needed for climate neutral and climate resilient development. You must promote the integration of climate change learnings into the curricula of institutions and the development of educational training materials for educators in accordance with national circumstances and cultural contexts. You must support the capacity building programs on climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as integrating climate change into the national education frameworks and education into climate change policies and programs, including NDCs and national adaptation plans. You must foster intersectoral collaboration between ministers of environment and education to promote climate change education. And lastly, you must provide opportunities for young people such as us, including leadership training, scholarship, paid internships with an emphasis on paid, and fellowship programs. Continuing with public awareness and mobilization, you must establish capacity building programs for decision makers and vulnerable populations with a focus on climate refugees on climate change. Public and research sectors, especially climate scientists, should devote more space to the dissemination and explanation of scientific results, solutions, policies, and programs. NGOs, universities, and youth groups need to be involved while enabling open access to climate change research by removing fees and subscription costs to scientific journals. Governments must adopt policies to prevent greenwashing campaigns and misleading commercial practices, as well as regulating advertising by high-emitting journals, or high-emitting companies. And lastly, in respect to media, journalists and communicators must convey the urgency and implications of this challenge. They must inform and educate communities about climate change in a conversational, inclusive, and accessible manner by simplifying scientific findings and facilitating the understanding of policies, impacts, documents, and solutions. They must commit to objective and transparent communication of climate change issues with a deeper focus on highlighting the inequalities of climate change and the diverse natures of its impacts and implications. Through all of the aforementioned demands, we as young people hope to see from you, world leaders, aggressive and ambitious policy implemented that will engage all sectors of our society in pursuing climate action. By giving young people like us a seat at the table when it comes to developing international climate strategy and policy, decision makers will be able to accelerate climate action and green recovery by tapping into innovative, progressive solutions. We are going to suffer the most if action is not taken. So please, don't let us or the planet down. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. So these are the key messages that were generated by the 4 tables during the last 2 days. You've seen there are many sharp and new proposals. And now, before opening the Agora, I would like to ask whether the Prime Ministers and the guests want to express some comment for a few minutes. I would start with the Prime Minister Mario Draghi and then Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for all your proposals. I think they're very reasonable, very to the point, and frankly, they draft a program for action for our governments. Let me say, please, let me say just one thing about us doing all this blah, blah, blah. Well, the blah, blah, blah sometimes is just a way to conceal ourselves and our inability to pursue with action and consistent action. But to some extent, when you have these transformational changes, it's actually useful to convince people that action is needed, to convince people that the numbers are used here, 1.5, net zero emissions, and so on, are not something that's been created by some artifact. These are science numbers, and people need to be convinced. Now, my sense is that now, maybe I'm too optimistic and I stand to be corrected by the real guys here, my sense is that the leaders are all absolutely convinced of the need to act and the need to act fast. And what all these events, like today's event, like the COP26, the G20, are actually addressing the question, how are we going to do this? Again, seems to me that another thing that I think leaders are quite uniformly convinced is that the fight to climate change is itself a fight for more equal distribution. I'm perhaps optimistic, but I don't think, I mean, here I stand to be corrected, but if you discuss the value of this persuasion, most people would agree with that. The numbers I was giving before, well, first of all, it's obvious in a sense, because we grown-ups have created this problem, not you. And the billions of youth, most of them are actually living in countries whose emissions are the lowest in the world because of their poverty. So the justice dimension of this is absolutely apparent. It doesn't need to be elaborated. But now we are better off than 2 or 3 years ago. I see more conviction amongst the leaders. Let's not forget that some leaders had abandoned the Paris Agreement, not even, what was that, 3 years ago? And so now they're changed. And I think we should thank President Biden for this decision. But next step is, how do we do that? So first of all, has to address the transition in an equitable fashion. And many of you, actually all of you now, have said that this has to be inclusive. Inclusive means to include the poorest, to include the most fragile, to include the poorest countries, and to include you. We cannot imagine anything being done in this field without your participation to decision-making. It's essential. These transformations, again, the size of these transformations is so huge that it cannot be parachuted over people like you, over countries like the poorest countries. So the first step is take conscience of what we have done. And I think to a great extent that's been achieved. The next step is to be absolutely persuaded you need to act, and act fast. And here is the real challenge. What I think your discontent, your possibly, I wouldn't say lack of trust, but certainly losing trust is caused by the slowness of this process, by the need to reach endless compromises, and by the speed. The speed is of essence now, because again, science tells us that we have a limited amount of time. So that's the challenge. That's where you will rate our efforts. And we all stand to be judged according to what we do, first and foremost, by the youth. Now, what we have over the next few months is an opportunity, perhaps a tremendous opportunity. I don't want to say unique opportunity, because I really wish that other events like this, the G20, the COP26, the United Nations work on this will continue, will repeat themselves year after year. But certainly the beginning, where we can actually first reach a pledge, an absolute pledge of $100 billion for the developing countries, not loans, grants. Thank you. And second, come out from these meetings with a broad alignment of goals. That's another very difficult dimension, because countries are very different across themselves. But we know that in this field, in the climate field, if the goals are not aligned, the targets are not going to be reached. So alignment of goals, which means that each country should share the same numbers, is very important. And it's very tough. very difficult. There are specific issues in the transition which will make things even more difficult. If you look at the recent increase in energy prices, everybody's asking whether this is going to be temporary or persistent, permanent. Well, we see causes of both kinds. Some things that have caused this increase are temporary, but other things like gigantic transitions out of coal into what? Into gas. And they're going to stay for a while. And that means that energy prices are going to be staying with us, perhaps not at the same level as we're seeing today, but staying with us for a while. So we have to reorganize our societies around this difficulty, this challenge that we have to. But let me now finish saying only that this is going to be difficult. I feel that all the leaders are fully committed, but it's not enough. That is not enough. Action has to be laid down, programs, clear targets, and never forget the weakest and the poorest in all this. Thank you.
Alok, before we say goodbye to the President, would you like to spend a few words as a comment? Because then we open the Agora and will be a longer session. Would you like to send a few words?
Roberto, thank you so much for that, and Prime Minister Draghi, wonderful words. We're going to have another session, so I can say more then, but can I firstly start by saying that I was with you virtually at the start of these few days, and I was incredibly moved by the speeches that we heard from Vanessa, from Greta, and the reality is that we have 400 delegates here who are youth leaders, but I'm also convinced that the 400 of you are people who are going to be leading your countries. We see future prime ministers, future presidents, future ministers sitting in this room. But the reality is the decisions that are taken by this group of leaders, the people that you're going to be hearing from after this, is what is going to be critical to the future that you inherit. And that's why I think this event has been so important. And I'll say more about this in the next session, but I've been incredibly impressed by what I've seen and the passion with which it has been delivered. That's absolutely vital. And a lot of what you're talking about is what we've been discussing through the COP agenda over the past year and a half. And I will say more about that. But thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for holding us to account. It's absolutely important and vital that you continue to do so right up till COP and indeed beyond as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alok. Thank you. Okay, we take 5 minutes break, and we thank again Prime Minister Mario Draghi for being here, and President Mattarella for being here. We have a short break, and then we start the Agora session. Once again, thank you very much for your presence here. It was an honor.